Long before satellites tracked every voyage and emergency beacons could summon help within minutes, the world's oceans occasionally delivered a sight that even experienced sailors struggled to explain. A ship would emerge on the horizon exactly where it should not have been, answering no signals as it drifted under silent canvas or with engines still running. When boarding parties finally climbed aboard, they sometimes found vessels that had survived the sea remarkably well, but not a single person remained to tell what had happened. As you move through these investigations, you will encounter merchant ships crossing the Atlantic, fishing boats returning from ordinary work, isolated yachts found far from land, and vessels whose stories have blurred the boundary between documented history and maritime legend. Piece by piece, the surviving evidence reveals how some of the sea's most enduring mysteries began not with a ship that disappeared, but with one that came back alone. The Mary Celeste, the ghost ship that defined the mystery. The Atlantic Ocean has long been a place where certainty ends at the horizon. For centuries, merchant ships crossed its vast expanse carrying cargo, passengers, and news between continents, yet once they disappeared beyond sight of land, they entered a world governed as much by weather and chance as by human skill. Storms could rise without warning, currents could carry a vessel far from its intended course, and a single mistake might leave no witnesses behind. Most ships that vanished at sea were eventually explained through wreckage or survivor accounts, but every so often a vessel would emerge from the empty ocean carrying a mystery that no investigation could fully resolve. Among all of them, one abandoned ship would become the benchmark against which every later ghost ship would be measured. The story begins not with disappearance but with a routine voyage. In early November 1872, the American brigantine Mary Celeste departed New York Harbour bound for Genoa, Italy. Built in Nova Scotia in 1861, under the original name Amazon before changing ownership and undergoing several modifications, she was regarded as a sturdy merchant vessel, despite an eventful past that included accidents and changes of command. Her new captain, Benjamin Spooner Briggs, was a respected and experienced mariner with an excellent reputation among fellow captains and shipping companies. At 37 years old, Briggs had spent much of his life at sea and was known as a careful navigator who avoided unnecessary risks. Friends described him as disciplined, deeply religious, and devoted to his family, making him an unlikely figure to abandon either his ship or his responsibilities without extraordinary cause. Unlike many merchant captains who travelled alone, Briggs chose to bring his wife, Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Matilda, aboard for the crossing. Their young son remained behind with relatives to continue his education, a common decision among seafaring families of the period. Alongside them sailed 7 carefully selected crew members, most of whom had solid maritime experience and favourable references. Contemporary records reveal no evidence of conflict among those on board before departure. On paper, it looked like the beginning of an ordinary commercial voyage undertaken by capable people, following a familiar route across one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. The Mary Celeste's cargo also appeared straightforward. Packed into her hold were approximately 700 barrels of denatured industrial alcohol, destined for Italian manufacturers. Unlike drinking alcohol, this cargo was intended for industrial use, but it remained highly flammable if vapours accumulated under the right conditions. The barrels were securely stowed before departure, provisions were loaded for several months, and the vessel carried the navigational equipment expected for an ocean crossing. Nothing in the surviving documentation suggested that anyone anticipated unusual danger before leaving New York on November 7th. Almost simultaneously, another merchant vessel prepared for a similar Atlantic crossing. The British brig Dei Gratia departed New York only days later, also bound for Europe. Her captain, David Morehouse, reportedly knew Benjamin Briggs personally, although historians continue to debate how close that acquaintance actually was. At the time, there was nothing remarkable about 2 ships leaving the same harbour for destinations across the Atlantic. Their paths simply happened to overlap in ways neither crew could have imagined. Weeks passed without incident known to history. No distress calls existed in that era, and ships remained isolated once they disappeared over the horizon. Their only record of daily events came through entries written in the captain's logbook whenever conditions allowed. Somewhere in the open Atlantic, the Mary Celeste continued eastward, and the final surviving log entry would eventually place her near the Azores on the morning of November 25th. The handwriting showed no signs of panic. The notation described routine navigation, weather observations and position calculations that appeared entirely consistent with an uneventful voyage. Then, without warning, the historical record falls silent. On December 4, 1872, Captain David Morehouse and the crew of the De Gratia spotted a brigantine sailing erratically roughly 600 nautical miles west of Portugal's coast, near the Azores. Experienced sailors immediately noticed something was wrong. The vessel's movement seemed uncertain, drifting in an unusual manner despite favourable weather. Her sails were partially set, but several hung loose or were damaged. No one appeared on deck to acknowledge signals from the approaching ship. At sea, where vessels normally greeted one another with visible activity, such silence demanded investigation. Morehouse ordered a boarding party led by First Mate Oliver Devoe. As the small boat approached, the mystery deepened. The vessel proved to be the Mary Celeste. Once aboard, Devoe found not a scene of violence or catastrophe, but something infinitely stranger. The ship was deserted. No captain waited in his cabin. No sailors emerged from below deck. No frightened passengers called for help. Every person who had departed New York nearly a month earlier had disappeared. Yet the ship itself remained astonishingly intact. Although some rigging required repair and several sails had been damaged by weather, the Mary Celeste remained seaworthy. There was water inside the hull, but later measurements estimated it at around 3.5 feet, an amount considered manageable for a wooden vessel of her size and not uncommon after weeks at sea. The pumps appeared to have experienced mechanical issues, though whether they had actually failed remained uncertain. Importantly, the vessel showed no evidence of the kind of flooding that would normally force an immediate evacuation. Below deck, the cargo remained largely undisturbed. Of the approximately 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, investigators later determined that 9 barrels were empty. Those barrels were made from porous red oak rather than the white oak used for the others, leading later studies to suggest their contents may simply have evaporated through the wood rather than leaked catastrophically. The remaining cargo stayed secured in place, with no indication that a violent explosion had occurred. The crew's personal belongings presented another puzzle. Clothing remained neatly stored. Valuable items had not been looted. Captain Briggs's sword still hung where it belonged. Food and water supplies were plentiful enough to complete the voyage. In the galley, preparations for daily life appeared interrupted rather than abandoned after prolonged struggle. The impression left upon the boarding party was not one of chaos, but of sudden absence. Some essential items, however, were missing. The ship's only lifeboat was gone. So too were the sextant, marine chronometer, and certain navigational documents that a captain would need if abandoning ship intentionally. The official register of the vessel remained aboard, but the logbook after November 25th had disappeared with those who left. These missing instruments strongly suggested that the departure had not been accidental. Someone had apparently organised an evacuation, believing there would be time to navigate elsewhere. But why leave a vessel still capable of sailing? That question has shaped every discussion of the Mary Celeste for more than a century. Once the abandoned brig reached Gibraltar under the command of the De Gratia's salvage crew, legal proceedings began almost immediately. Maritime law required courts to determine whether those claiming salvage rights had acted honestly or whether fraud had played a role in the discovery. The Attorney General of Gibraltar, Frederick Solly Flood, became deeply suspicious. He questioned whether the crew of the De Gratia might somehow have murdered those aboard the Mary Celeste before staging the abandonment to collect salvage money. Investigators examined the vessel with extraordinary care for the standards of the day. They inspected stains that some initially suspected to be blood, only for later analysis to cast doubt on such conclusions. Damage to the ship proved consistent with ordinary wear rather than violent conflict. No evidence emerged connecting Morehouse or his crew to foul play. Despite Solly Flood's suspicions, the court ultimately found no basis for criminal charges, although the unusually modest salvage award reflected lingering uncertainty surrounding the case. With no crime proven and no survivors found, the investigation reached an unsatisfying end. Officially, no one could explain why the Mary Celeste had been abandoned. Into that vacuum poured speculation. Mutiny became one of the earliest theories, proposing that dissatisfied sailors had overpowered Captain Briggs before escaping. Yet this idea struggled against the known character of both captain and crew, as well as the complete absence of violence aboard the vessel. Piracy offered another possibility, but pirates generally sought valuables or cargo, neither of which had been taken. Insurance fraud occasionally surfaced as an explanation, despite investigators finding no convincing evidence that Briggs or the ship's owners stood to benefit from such an elaborate scheme. Natural explanations gradually attracted greater attention as maritime knowledge expanded. One influential hypothesis suggested that fumes from leaking alcohol barrels may have accumulated below deck. Even without an explosion, the sound of escaping vapours or a brief pressure event could have convinced Briggs that a catastrophic blast was imminent. If he temporarily evacuated everyone into the lifeboat while towing it behind the ship, intending to return once the danger had passed, a snapped towline or worsening weather might have separated the small boat from the drifting brig forever. Modern experiments have given this theory some support. In 2006, researchers conducted controlled tests, demonstrating that alcohol vapours could produce an explosive pressure wave without leaving the scorching or structural damage normally associated with fire. Such an event might have frightened an experienced captain into ordering an immediate but temporary evacuation. While impossible to prove, the findings showed that panic could arise even when a ship remained physically intact. Other researchers have focused on the ship's navigation. The final recorded position in the logbook may have underestimated the vessel's distance from land because of imperfect chronometer readings or weather conditions. Briggs may have believed the Mary Celeste was dangerously close to reefs surrounding the Azores, while simultaneously concluding that malfunctioning pumps prevented him from accurately judging the amount of water entering the hull. Faced with what appeared to be a sinking ship approaching hazardous coastline, abandoning temporarily into the lifeboat may have seemed the safer decision. Even so, every explanation leaves unanswered questions. If Briggs feared explosion, why were signs of panic absent? If flooding worried him, why abandon a vessel still floating securely? If the lifeboat drifted away accidentally, why was no trace of its occupants ever recovered despite extensive shipping routes across the Atlantic? Every theory resolves part of the mystery while creating another. The enduring fascination of the Mary Celeste owes much to the remarkable quality of its surviving documentation. Court records, newspaper accounts, ship logs, insurance documents, and witness testimony allow historians to reconstruct the voyage with unusual precision. Ironically, that abundance of evidence has not solved the mystery, but sharpened it, because the more clearly the known facts emerge, the more difficult it becomes to understand the final decision made aboard the ship. Popular culture has only deepened the legend. Writers embellished the story with fictional meals left untouched, steaming cups of tea, and dramatic signs of terror that were never recorded by the boarding party. Arthur Conan Doyle's fictionalized short story, J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, published in 1884, introduced invented details that many readers later mistook for historical fact. Over time, the boundary between documented evidence and literary imagination blurred, transforming the Mary Celeste from a maritime investigation into one of history's most enduring ghost ship legends. Yet stripped of embellishment, the documented facts remain unsettling enough on their own. A competent captain, a trusted crew, a healthy child and her mother, a ship capable of completing its voyage, a lifeboat missing, valuable cargo untouched, and an ocean that has never surrendered a single confirmed answer about what happened after the final log entry. Somewhere between that ordinary morning near the Azores and the moment the Dei Gratia spotted an empty brig drifting across the Atlantic, the people aboard the Mary Celeste made a decision that history still cannot fully explain. The Carroll A. Deering, the schooner found with dinner, still waiting. Long before investigators learned the schooner's name, the waters surrounding North Carolina's Diamond Shoals had already earned a reputation for swallowing certainty as easily as they claimed ships. Stretching off the outer banks, these shifting sandbars lay hidden beneath the Atlantic's surface, where powerful currents, unpredictable shoals, and changing weather combined to create one of the most dangerous stretches of coastline in the United States. Mariners had long referred to the surrounding waters as part of the graveyard of the Atlantic, a name earned through centuries of wrecks scattered along the coast. Most vessels that reached these shoals did so because storms, navigational errors, or mechanical failures left them with few alternatives. Yet one arrival would become different from all the others, because the greatest mystery was never how the ship reached the shore, but why no one remained aboard to witness its final moments. Against that unforgiving coastline, a large 5-masted vessel eventually came to rest, where experienced mariners knew no captain would willingly steer. In the early hours of January 31st, 1921, the schooner Carroll A. Deering ran hard aground on Diamond Shoals near Cape Hatteras. From shore, members of the United States Life-Saving Service could clearly see the ship resting firmly on the sandbars, its towering masts still standing against the winter sky. Rough seas prevented any immediate rescue attempt, forcing observers to wait until conditions improved. At first glance, the vessel appeared damaged but largely intact, creating the reasonable expectation that at least some members of the crew might still be aboard awaiting assistance. Stepping aboard revealed a scene that was neither violent nor ordinary, but one that immediately suggested the voyage had ended in a way no one could readily explain. When rescuers finally reached the schooner several days later, every person aboard had vanished. There were no bodies, no injured sailors, and no obvious signs of struggle. Instead, investigators found evidence that the crew had departed in an organised but hurried manner. Personal belongings remained scattered throughout the vessel, suggesting that whatever had happened did not allow everyone the opportunity to gather their possessions before leaving. The galley provided one of the most enduring images associated with the mystery. Food had apparently been prepared for a meal, reinforcing the impression that ordinary life aboard the ship had been interrupted rather than gradually abandoned. Although later retellings sometimes exaggerated what investigators actually found, contemporary accounts consistently described a vessel that showed no evidence of the catastrophic destruction one might expect from piracy, violent mutiny, or an onboard disaster. The crew had disappeared, but the ship itself retained many of the quiet details of everyday work at sea. Other discoveries complicated the picture even further. The vessel's 2 anchors were missing, along with the ship's logbook, navigational equipment, and the lifeboats. These absences suggested that the crew had not simply vanished without preparation. At some point before the schooner grounded, essential equipment had been removed from the ship. Whether this represented a deliberate evacuation or an unsuccessful attempt to save themselves could never be determined with certainty. Meanwhile, cargo and much of the ship's equipment remained aboard, offering no indication that thieves or pirates had stripped the vessel before abandoning it. Only after examining what remained on the stranded schooner does it become possible to retrace the voyage that brought her there. The Carroll A. Deering had been built in Bath, Maine, in 1919 for the G.G. Deering Company, part of an era when large sailing vessels still carried commercial cargo, despite the growing dominance of steam-powered ships. Measuring over 250 feet in length and equipped with 5 towering masts, she ranked among the largest wooden schooners ever constructed in the United States. Her size allowed her to transport enormous quantities of bulk cargo across international routes, though it also required an experienced crew capable of handling an increasingly demanding sailing vessel during a period when such expertise was becoming less common. Months earlier, the Carroll A. Deering had departed on what appeared to be another routine commercial voyage under the command of Captain William B. Wormel, a veteran mariner nearing the end of his career. Wormel had spent decades at sea and enjoyed a reputation for competence earned through years of successful voyages. Friends reportedly believed he intended to retire after completing this assignment, making the journey particularly significant in his long career. Few could have imagined that it would instead become the final chapter of his life. The schooner carried a cargo of coal from Newport News, Virginia, to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, successfully completing the southbound portion of the voyage before preparing for the return trip. Delivering coal across the Atlantic remained an important commercial enterprise during the early 20th century, and nothing about the outward voyage attracted unusual attention. Once unloaded in Brazil, the vessel began sailing north again without cargo, making for the eastern seaboard of the United States. Evidence from the ship's final port calls gradually revealed small moments that, in hindsight, carried far greater significance than anyone recognized at the time. During a stop in Barbados in January 1921, Captain Wormel reportedly expressed concerns regarding the conduct of his first mate. Accounts recorded after the disappearance suggest there had been disagreements between senior officers aboard the vessel, although historians continue to debate the seriousness of those disputes. Like many details surrounding the Deering, the available evidence is incomplete, leaving room for interpretation but little opportunity for certainty. Even if tensions existed, disagreements aboard merchant ships were hardly unusual. Long voyages placed crews under immense physical and emotional strain, particularly aboard sailing vessels that demanded constant labour regardless of weather. Personality conflicts, disciplinary disagreements, and disputes over authority occurred throughout maritime history without leading to disappearance. Consequently, while later investigators considered these reports significant, they alone offered no convincing explanation for the fate of everyone aboard. One encounter near the North Carolina coast would later become among the last credible observations of the Deering before everything fell silent. On January 28, 1921, the Cape Lookout lightship reported seeing the schooner pass nearby. The lightship's keeper later stated that a man aboard the Deering, who did not appear to be Captain Warmel, shouted that the vessel had lost both anchors. The unusual nature of the exchange immediately stood out. Under ordinary circumstances, the captain himself would likely have communicated with nearby maritime authorities, particularly if the ship required assistance. The report became even more intriguing because the unidentified speaker also requested that the message be forwarded to the vessel's owners. Before additional questions could be asked, another ship appeared in the vicinity, and the opportunity for further communication ended. At the time, the exchange attracted little immediate attention. Only after the Carroll A. Deering was discovered abandoned did investigators revisit the testimony, recognizing it as one of the last direct observations of people known to have been aboard. Exactly what happened during the following days remains unknown. Without the ship's logbook or any surviving crew members, investigators were forced to reconstruct events through scattered observations, navigational estimates, and the physical condition of the vessel itself. Every conclusion depended upon evidence that was incomplete from the beginning. By the time government investigators assembled the available testimony, the trail had already grown frustratingly incomplete despite the number of witnesses involved. The United States government launched an extensive investigation involving several agencies, including the Department of Commerce and the Bureau of Investigation, the organization that would later become the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Given the unusual circumstances and growing public interest, officials explored virtually every plausible explanation supported by the available evidence. The timing of the mystery complicated matters considerably. The early 1920s witnessed heightened concern about political extremism following the First World War and the Russian Revolution. As a result, investigators even considered whether Bolshevik agents or radical labor groups might somehow have seized the vessel. These theories reflected the anxieties of the era more than they reflected concrete evidence. Despite considerable attention, investigators uncovered nothing linking the Deering to organized political activity or international conspiracies. Piracy also received careful consideration, although the evidence again proved weak. Traditional pirates generally sought valuable cargo, money, or easily sold goods, yet the schooner contained little of obvious value after completing its delivery in Brazil. Furthermore, no evidence indicated widespread looting or violence aboard the vessel. The absence of bodies, bloodshed, or extensive damage left investigators without the physical evidence normally associated with an armed takeover. Mutiny appeared more plausible to some officials, particularly given reports of disagreements involving senior officers. Supporters of this theory suggested dissatisfied crew members may have seized control before abandoning the captain and eventually leaving the ship themselves. Yet this explanation also faced significant difficulties. No confirmed evidence demonstrated that the crew had acted collectively against Captain Warmel, nor did it explain why every individual subsequently disappeared without leaving a trace. A successful mutiny would have solved one mystery only by creating another. Natural forces offered additional possibilities. Losing both anchors while navigating the waters off Cape Hatteras would have placed the schooner in an increasingly dangerous position. Strong currents around Diamond Shoals frequently overwhelmed sailing vessels, particularly if they lost the ability to hold position during deteriorating weather. Some historians believe the crew may have attempted to abandon ship before it struck the shoals, hoping to reach safety in lifeboats. If so, rough winter seas could easily have overwhelmed small boats long before they reached land, leaving the unmanned schooner to drift until it grounded. This explanation fits several known facts. The missing lifeboats and navigational equipment suggest an organized departure rather than sudden disappearance. The missing anchors correspond with the final report from the Cape Lookout lightship. Yet even this relatively straightforward scenario cannot answer every question. Why abandon a vessel before it actually grounded? Why were no survivors or identifiable wreckage from the lifeboats ever recovered? And why did no confirmed distress signal reach nearby stations despite the ship sailing through well-travelled waters? As investigators continued examining the evidence, another maritime mystery unexpectedly complicated the case. Around the same period, the steamship Hewitt disappeared while sailing between Texas and Maine with all hands aboard. Because both incidents occurred within weeks of one another, some officials briefly wondered whether they might somehow be connected through piracy or criminal activity operating along the Atlantic coast. Despite considerable speculation, no convincing evidence ever established a relationship between the two disappearances. Public fascination with the Carroll A. Deering only intensified as years passed without answers. Newspapers frequently highlighted the most mysterious aspects of the abandoned schooner, sometimes blending verified evidence with speculation to satisfy growing public curiosity. Stories emphasizing meals left behind, mysterious strangers aboard, or elaborate conspiracies often overshadowed the far more complicated historical record. Like many famous maritime mysteries, the Deering gradually acquired layers of legend that extended well beyond what investigators had actually documented. Modern historians generally approach the case with greater caution, separating established facts from decades of embellishment. They recognise that the evidence points toward an emergency severe enough to convince an experienced crew to leave their vessel, yet insufficient to explain why none of them survived or were ever conclusively identified afterward. Every major theory remains constrained by the same missing pieces: no eyewitnesses, no recovered lifeboats, no logbook, and no definitive physical evidence capable of reconstructing the crew's final decisions. More than a century later, the Carroll A. Deering remains less remarkable for where she was found than for the enduring silence surrounding the people who should have been aboard. The schooner herself eventually succumbed to the relentless Atlantic, broken apart by waves before salvagers could preserve much of the wreck, removing the possibility that future investigators might uncover overlooked clues within her timbers. What survives today exists largely in official reports, photographs, witness testimony, and the unanswered questions they continue to raise. Whatever unfolded before the Carroll A. Deering reached Diamond Shoals, it left behind a ship full of clues, but no one who could explain the final voyage. The MV Joyita, the ship that refused to sink. Across the scattered islands of the South Pacific, a ship's arrival was more than a matter of schedule. It was often the only dependable connection between distant communities separated by hundreds of miles of open water. Before regular air travel reached many of these islands, cargo vessels carried food, medicine, mail, and passengers across routes that could not simply be replaced if one journey failed. Families measured time by the appearance of familiar ships on the horizon. Traders relied on them to sustain local economies, and isolated settlements often waited days or weeks for the next opportunity to receive supplies. Most voyages passed with little attention beyond the ports they served, but when one expected arrival never came, the silence spread far beyond the water itself. Among the vessels serving those isolated routes was the MV Joyita, a ship whose unusual construction earned it a reputation for remarkable resilience at sea. Built in Los Angeles in 1931 as a luxury motor yacht, the Joyita was designed with thick cedar planking over sturdy frames and incorporated extensive cork insulation within her hull. She also contained large volumes of airtight buoyancy, making her exceptionally difficult to sink even if she took on significant amounts of water. Over the years, the vessel changed owners and purposes, serving in a variety of civilian roles and contributing to Allied operations in the Pacific during the Second World War, before eventually returning to commercial service. By the mid-1950s, she had become a familiar sight operating between islands, transporting passengers and cargo through waters where dependable vessels were indispensable. Her reputation for durability made practical sense. Unlike many ships of comparable size, the Joyita had been built with buoyancy as a defining feature rather than an afterthought. Mariners familiar with her construction understood that she could remain afloat under conditions that might overwhelm more conventional vessels. This characteristic would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the mystery, because it suggested that abandoning the ship would have required circumstances far more complicated than the simple fear of sinking. Nothing about the voyage that departed Apia on October 3, 1955, suggested that it would become one of the Pacific's most enduring maritime mysteries. Commanded by Captain Thomas Henry Miller, the Joyita left Samoa bound for the Tokelau Islands, a journey of roughly 270 miles across open ocean. On board were 16 crew members and 9 passengers, bringing the total to 25 people. The vessel also carried food, medical supplies, and commercial cargo intended for communities that depended upon regular deliveries. Although the ship had experienced maintenance issues before departure, nothing publicly indicated that those aboard expected the voyage to end differently from countless others completed along the same route. Like many commercial vessels operating between remote islands, the Joy Eater maintained a demanding schedule. Delays could occur because of weather or mechanical difficulties, but they were generally measured in hours rather than weeks. Communication technology in the mid-20th century remained limited compared with modern standards, particularly across vast stretches of the Pacific, yet ship operators still expected periodic contact and timely arrivals. When those expectations were not met, concern gradually spread among those waiting ashore. Days passed without the Joy Eater reaching Tokelau, and what first appeared to be an ordinary delay gradually became a source of growing concern. Local authorities initially allowed for the possibility that rough weather or engine trouble had slowed the vessel's progress. Such setbacks were hardly unprecedented in Pacific waters, where changing sea conditions could easily disrupt carefully planned schedules. However, as additional time passed without any confirmed communication, confidence gave way to uncertainty. Families waited for news that never arrived, while officials began considering the increasingly troubling possibility that the vessel had suffered a serious emergency far from land. The absence of radio contact intensified those fears. Ships operating across isolated regions depended heavily on their wireless equipment, especially when mechanical failures or navigational problems arose. Even if a vessel could not continue under its own power, transmitting its position significantly improved the chances of rescue. Yet no verified distress message from the Joy Eater reached authorities during the voyage. The silence suggested either that communication equipment had failed or that circumstances aboard had prevented the crew from using it effectively. As hope gave way to urgency, aircraft and ships began sweeping enormous sections of the Pacific in search of any sign that the missing vessel still existed. Search operations covered thousands of square miles of open ocean, an immense undertaking complicated by the sheer size of the Pacific and the uncertainty surrounding the ship's last known position. Patrol aircraft scanned the water from above, while vessels searched likely routes below, but each passing day reduced confidence that survivors would be found. Without wreckage, oil slicks, or floating debris, investigators struggled even to determine whether the Joy Eater had sunk or drifted far beyond her intended course. The search continued for weeks without producing definitive answers. Unlike many maritime disasters in which storms leave visible evidence, the Joy Eater seemed simply to have disappeared between departure and destination. Every unsuccessful search expanded the area in which the vessel might be located, making the operation progressively more difficult. By late October, many feared that the Pacific had claimed another ship without leaving behind enough evidence to reconstruct what had happened. More than a month after the Joy Eater had vanished from its expected route, the search produced a discovery that only deepened the mystery. On November 10, 1955, the merchant vessel Tuvalu sighted the missing ship drifting north of Vanua-Levu in Fiji, approximately 600 miles from her intended route. The Joy Eater had not sunk. Instead, she remained afloat, slowly drifting through the Pacific despite having been missing for over 5 weeks. No signal announced her presence. No survivors called from her decks. The vessel had simply continued floating, until chance placed another ship within sight of her weathered hull. Drifting hundreds of miles from where she was supposed to be, the vessel remained stubbornly afloat despite sustaining damage that suggested something had gone seriously wrong. The ship listed noticeably to one side after taking on water, yet she remained buoyant enough to avoid sinking entirely. Her engines were no longer operating, and investigators later determined that one engine had been dismantled to some extent, apparently during attempts at repair. Water had entered parts of the vessel through damaged piping, associated with the cooling system contributing to the flooding found aboard. Even so, the Joy Eater's remarkable construction prevented her from disappearing beneath the surface. The condition of the vessel presented investigators with a contradiction. Everything suggested that the voyage had encountered genuine difficulties, yet none of those problems appeared severe enough to explain why every person aboard had abandoned a ship specifically designed to remain afloat. The Joy Eater had endured the very circumstances her builders intended her to survive, but those entrusted with her operation had somehow concluded that remaining aboard was no longer the safest option. Inspecting the ship raised far more questions than answers, because several ordinary objects had disappeared while countless others remained exactly where they belonged. The vessel's lifeboat was missing, indicating that those aboard had likely left voluntarily rather than vanishing without preparation. Also absent were the ship's logbook, sextant, chronometer, and portable radio equipment, precisely the items a captain would normally take if attempting an organised evacuation. Their absence suggested planning rather than panic, yet the surrounding evidence painted a far more complicated picture. Much of the cargo remained aboard. Personal belongings had not been comprehensively gathered, and many supplies remained untouched. Investigators also noted that medical equipment appeared disturbed, with reports indicating that bandages and medical materials had been used or removed from their usual storage. Some accounts mentioned blood-stained bandages among the items found aboard, though the available evidence never established whose injuries they may have treated or whether they related directly to the disappearance. Like many details in the Joy Eater investigation, these observations generated more speculation than certainty. The vessel's radio attracted particular attention during the inquiry. Investigators found that its antenna had been damaged, significantly reducing its effective transmission range. Some assessments concluded that the radio may still have functioned, but only over much shorter distances than intended. If the crew believed they could no longer communicate with nearby ships or coastal stations, their perception of the situation may have differed dramatically from the reality. Isolated in open ocean with uncertain navigation, mechanical problems and limited communications, even experienced mariners might have judged the circumstances more dangerous than they actually were. One characteristic of the Joy Eater made the investigation especially difficult to explain, since the vessel had been designed to remain buoyant even under extreme conditions. Her cork-lined hull and trapped airspaces meant that complete sinking remained extraordinarily unlikely unless the vessel suffered catastrophic structural destruction. Investigators understood this from the beginning. The Joy Eater herself became living evidence of that design, surviving more than a month adrift despite flooding that would have overwhelmed many other ships. Ironically, the very feature intended to protect those aboard became one of the greatest obstacles to understanding why they had disappeared. This paradox has shaped every serious examination of the case. Had the Joy Eater sunk quickly, the mystery might have been explained as another tragic maritime disaster. Instead, investigators confronted a vessel that appeared to have fulfilled its engineering purpose almost perfectly. The ship survived. The passengers and crew did not. Reconciling those two facts has proven remarkably difficult. Official inquiries examined every plausible scenario, yet each explanation eventually collided with evidence that refused to fit neatly into a single conclusion. Mechanical failure received considerable attention because the damaged cooling system and disabled engines clearly demonstrated that the vessel had experienced operational problems. Flooding resulting from failed piping may have convinced Captain Miller that the situation would continue deteriorating, particularly if malfunctioning pumps prevented effective control of the incoming water. Some investigators suggested that the captain, believing the vessel was in greater danger than it actually was, ordered everyone into the lifeboat while intending to remain close to the drifting ship. Such decisions have precedent in maritime history, particularly when captains feared imminent sinking. If rough weather, heavy swells, or a failed tow line subsequently separated the lifeboat from the still floating Joy Eater, those aboard would have faced the Pacific in a far more vulnerable craft, while the abandoned vessel continued drifting unattended. Other theories proved more speculative. Piracy occasionally entered public discussion, although investigators found little evidence supporting an armed takeover. Valuable cargo remained aboard, and nothing suggested systematic looting. Criminal activity could not be entirely dismissed, but neither could it satisfactorily explain why an otherwise buoyant ship had been left behind while every person disappeared. Suggestions involving wartime mines or submerged hazards also surfaced from time to time, reflecting lingering memories of the Pacific conflict only a decade earlier. Yet no physical evidence indicated that the Joy Eater had struck an explosive device or suffered catastrophic external damage. Likewise, theories involving supernatural explanations gained public attention largely because conventional answers remained incomplete, rather than because investigators uncovered evidence pointing in those directions. Decades of research have narrowed certain possibilities without eliminating the central question that continues to define the Joy Eater's place in maritime history. Most historians agree that the vessel almost certainly experienced genuine mechanical and flooding problems, and many consider an organised abandonment the most plausible broad explanation. Yet agreeing that the crew left the ship does not explain why they believed abandoning one of the Pacific's most buoyant vessels offered a greater chance of survival than remaining aboard. The official inquiry ultimately concluded without identifying a definitive cause for the disappearance. No confirmed trace of Captain Miller, his crew, or the passengers has ever been recovered. The missing lifeboat was never conclusively found, nor did later discoveries provide evidence capable of resolving the mystery. What remains instead is an unusually detailed record of a ship that survived long after the people responsible for navigating her had vanished. Unlike many famous ghost ships whose mysteries revolve around perfectly preserved vessels, the Joyita tells a different story. She bore visible scars of mechanical failure, flooding, and desperate attempts to keep operating, making clear that those aboard had faced real challenges before disappearing. Yet those documented difficulties never reached the point where the vessel itself surrendered to the sea. She continued floating through the Pacific exactly as her builders intended, carrying with her silent evidence that could describe the crisis but never fully explain the choices made during it. The MV Joyita survived the Pacific long enough to tell investigators that something had happened aboard, but not long enough to reveal what became of the 25 people who were never seen again. The Kaz, too, lunch was still on the table. From a distance, a yacht under full sail rarely attracts concern, because motion itself usually suggests that someone remains at the helm. Along Australia's northeastern coastline, recreational vessels regularly travel between islands and harbours, their sails catching steady winds as they follow familiar routes through the Whitsunday Islands and the Coral Sea. To passing pilots, fishermen, or other sailors, a yacht making good progress under sail usually represents routine activity rather than cause for alarm. It is only when the expected signs of human presence disappear that an ordinary scene begins to feel deeply unsettling, transforming a vessel still moving across open water into the beginning of a mystery. Everything changed when observers realised the vessel continued following the coastline without a single person visible on deck. On April 18, 2007, a helicopter pilot flying near the Great Barrier Reef spotted a 9.8-metre catamaran sailing in conditions that appeared normal, except for one troubling detail. The yacht remained under power and sail, but no one acknowledged the aircraft overhead. There was no movement in the cockpit, no crew adjusting the sails, and no one responding to repeated attempts to attract attention. Because boats occasionally operate with people below deck, the situation did not immediately suggest an emergency, yet the complete absence of visible activity soon prompted authorities to investigate. A nearby water police vessel intercepted the drifting yacht and prepared to board. Even before stepping aboard, officers noticed that the vessel showed no obvious signs of collision, fire, or storm damage. The sails remained raised, the hull appeared sound, and nothing about its outward conditions suggested that it had endured the kind of catastrophic event normally associated with an abandoned vessel. Unlike many famous ghost ships that were discovered weeks or months after disappearing, this yacht was still actively making its way across the sea, as though its voyage had simply continued without the people responsible for steering it. Boarding the yacht transformed an unusual sight into one of Australia's most unsettling maritime investigations. Officers quickly confirmed that the vessel was the Kaz 2 and that no one remained aboard. Every cabin, storage compartment and accessible space was searched, yet the result was the same. The yacht had become completely empty. There were no injured passengers awaiting rescue, no hidden crew members, and no evidence that anyone had recently returned to the vessel after entering the water. 3 experienced sailors had departed aboard the Kaz 2 only days earlier, yet none of them could be found anywhere on or around the yacht. Meals, navigation equipment, and personal belongings created the unmistakable impression that ordinary life aboard had been interrupted only moments earlier. Food had been prepared and partially eaten, giving rise to the often repeated description that lunch was still on the table when authorities boarded. While later retelling sometimes exaggerated certain details, investigators did document evidence that suggested the crew had been engaged in routine daily activities before disappearing. Personal effects remained inside the cabins. Clothing and equipment had not been systematically packed, and the yacht itself retained the appearance of a vessel whose occupants expected to return within minutes rather than abandon it permanently. The navigation equipment added another layer of uncertainty. The yacht's GPS remained operational, and electronic systems continued functioning. The engine was still running when the vessel was intercepted, allowing the yacht to continue moving despite the absence of anyone controlling it. This combination of operating equipment and missing crew distinguished the CAS-2 from many earlier maritime mysteries, where damaged vessels or failed navigation systems offered at least partial explanations for why a ship had been found adrift. Here, the technology remained largely intact, yet the people responsible for using it had disappeared. Behind those silent cabins were 3 experienced sailors whose voyage had begun with none of the warning signs normally associated with maritime disasters. The men aboard were Peter Tunstead, his brother James Tunstead, and Derek Batten. All 3 possessed sailing experience, and the voyage itself was recreational rather than commercial. They were not transporting hazardous cargo, navigating through wartime waters, or attempting an unusually dangerous crossing. Instead, they planned a relatively familiar journey along one of Australia's best-known coastal regions, where countless yachts travelled each year. Their experience at sea makes the mystery particularly compelling. Maritime accidents often involve inexperienced crews confronted by rapidly changing conditions or difficult navigation. In contrast, the men aboard the CAS-2 understood the basic demands of sailing and the importance of safety procedures. Although experience cannot eliminate every risk at sea, it generally reduces the likelihood that routine situations will develop into fatal emergencies. This fact has encouraged investigators to examine not only what happened aboard the yacht, but also how quickly an apparently manageable situation could have escalated beyond recovery. Departing from Airlie Beach in April 2007, the CAS-2 set out on what was intended to be a routine coastal sailing trip. The Whitsunday Islands offer some of Australia's most popular sailing waters, attracting both experienced mariners and recreational travellers. Sheltered passages alternate with more open stretches of sea, creating conditions that are generally favourable while still demanding constant attention from those at the helm. Nothing reported before departure suggested that the voyage would attract unusual attention or require emergency assistance. The yacht continued along its intended route without any immediately documented indication of serious trouble. Unlike historical mysteries in which communication depended upon infrequent visual sightings or handwritten logbooks, the CAS-2 existed in an era of satellite navigation, modern marine radios, and coordinated rescue services. These technological advances have solved countless maritime emergencies over recent decades, making unexplained disappearances increasingly rare. Yet technology can only preserve evidence that actually exists, and in this case the most important moments occurred beyond the reach of any recording device. The final confirmed communications offered little indication that anything aboard the yacht had begun to unravel. Investigators found no verified distress call suggesting that the crew faced immediate danger, nor did surviving communications reveal escalating panic before contact ceased. This absence proved significant because experienced sailors typically attempt to report emergencies whenever circumstances allow. If conditions deteriorate gradually, radio communication often continues long enough to provide rescuers with at least a general understanding of the situation. The lack of such information left investigators with almost no direct evidence describing the yacht's final hours. Examining each section of the vessel allowed investigators to reconstruct not what they knew had happened, but what they believed could have happened. The deck offered no clear evidence of violence. The rigging remained largely intact, and nothing suggested that the yacht had suffered structural failure. Safety equipment was inspected carefully to determine whether any items had been deployed during an emergency. Every observation was measured against the physical realities of sailing, with investigators attempting to understand how 3 men could disappear while leaving the vessel itself capable of continuing its journey. Attention soon focused on equipment associated with personal safety. Reports indicated that 1 life jacket was missing, while other safety gear remained aboard. This seemingly minor detail assumed greater importance because it hinted that at least 1 member of the crew may have entered the water under circumstances that prompted some attempt at rescue. Yet the available evidence could not establish whether the missing life jacket had been worn successfully, deployed during an emergency, or simply lost before authorities boarded the vessel. As with many aspects of the investigation, the facts supported several possibilities without confirming any single one. The yacht's autopilot also received careful examination. Modern sailing vessels frequently rely upon autopilot systems to maintain a steady heading, while crews perform other necessary tasks on deck. If the CAS-2 had been operating under autopilot when an emergency occurred, The yacht could have continued sailing for considerable distances even after everyone aboard entered the water. This possibility offered a practical explanation for why the vessel remained underway when discovered, but it did not explain how every sailor came to leave the yacht in the first place. One possibility gradually emerged as more consistent with the physical evidence than the dramatic explanations that quickly spread through the media. Investigators considered the likelihood that one crew member accidentally fell overboard while the yacht remained underway. Maritime practice strongly encourages immediate rescue attempts because survival chances decline rapidly once a person is left behind, particularly if the vessel continues moving under sail. Faced with such an emergency, another crew member may instinctively enter the water or maneuver to assist, while the remaining sailor attempts to recover both men. Under certain circumstances, however, a rescue attempt can quickly overwhelm even experienced crews. If the yacht continues moving while those in the water struggle against waves or currents, recovering multiple people becomes increasingly difficult. A single mistake during the rescue effort may place additional crew members at risk, particularly if the vessel is not brought fully under control. Investigators concluded that this general sequence represented the most plausible explanation consistent with the available evidence, although the precise order of events could never be determined. Even this reconstruction contains unavoidable uncertainty. No eyewitness survived to confirm whether someone initially fell overboard, voluntarily entered the water to assist another, or encountered an entirely different emergency. Without bodies, recorded communications, or direct testimony, investigators could establish only what seemed most likely, rather than what could be proven beyond doubt. The difference between those two standards has allowed the mystery to endure long after the official investigation ended. Even so, several crucial moments remained beyond reconstruction because no witness survived to describe the sequence of events. The sea erased the only first-hand accounts capable of explaining exactly how the emergency began. Unlike a shipwreck where physical damage often preserves clues about the final catastrophe, the CAS-2 remained largely intact, leaving investigators with remarkably little evidence of the decisive event itself. Ironically, the yacht's good condition removed many of the signs that might otherwise have clarified the circumstances of the disappearance. Unlike many famous ghost ships of earlier centuries, this mystery unfolded in an age of modern navigation, satellite tracking, and coordinated search efforts. Yet certainty remained just as elusive. Advances in maritime technology have dramatically reduced the number of vessels that disappear without explanation, but they have not eliminated the unpredictability of accidents occurring beyond the view of other ships. The CAS-2 demonstrates that even in the 21st century, a brief sequence of unforeseen events can still leave investigators confronting unanswered questions remarkably similar to those posed by far older maritime mysteries. Years later, the CAS-2 continues to occupy a unique place among maritime mysteries because the yacht itself never truly disappeared from view. It remained afloat, operational, and visible, preserving an almost ordinary image that contrasted sharply with the extraordinary absence of those who had sailed aboard her. Rather than becoming another lost vessel swallowed by the sea, the CAS-2 returned as silent evidence that the ocean does not always conceal its mysteries beneath the waves. Sometimes it leaves the answers drifting in plain sight, while quietly withholding the one moment investigators most need to understand. The CAS-2 completed its loneliest voyage under open skies, leaving only an empty yacht to suggest that 3 experienced sailors had somehow vanished without a final witness. The High Aim 6, an empty fishing boat in open water. Commercial fishing is built on long periods of isolation, where crews can spend days or even weeks working beyond the sight of every other vessel. Once a boat leaves port and disappears over the horizon, its daily routine unfolds across enormous stretches of ocean, where radio traffic is limited, weather changes without warning, and encounters with other ships may be separated by hundreds of miles. For those working aboard these vessels, such isolation is an accepted part of the profession, rather than an unusual circumstance. Yet that same isolation also means that when something goes wrong, there are often no witnesses, no immediate rescue, and no reliable record of the events that unfolded. In rare cases, the sea returns only the vessel itself, leaving investigators to confront a mystery that begins with almost nothing. Registered in Taiwan, the High Aim 6 operated as one of thousands of fishing boats that routinely crossed the Western Pacific in search of productive waters. Commercial fishing fleets from across East Asia regularly spend extended periods operating far from their home ports, following seasonal migrations of fish through waters shared by multiple nations. These voyages require careful coordination, but they also demand a degree of independence, as crews frequently work well beyond the range of constant oversight. Although many boats return without attracting attention, the disappearance of even a single crew can become extraordinarily difficult to investigate once the vessel has crossed international waters. The High Aim 6 was engaged in exactly this kind of long-distance fishing operation before the mystery began. By the time authorities became aware that something was wrong, the crucial early moments had already disappeared into the vastness of the Pacific. Unlike accidents that occur close to shore, where witnesses or emergency responders may preserve an accurate timeline, this case offered investigators almost no certainty about when communication ceased, where the crew had last been seen together, or what conditions existed during their final hours aboard. Months into its voyage, the vessel unexpectedly reappeared under circumstances that immediately puzzled the authorities who first encountered it. In January 2003, the High Aim 6 was located drifting in Australian waters off the northwestern coast after being spotted from the air during a routine surveillance operation. From above, nothing immediately suggested catastrophe. The fishing boat remained afloat, showing no obvious signs of fire, collision, or structural destruction. It was simply moving with the sea, separated from the people who should have been operating it. The discovery immediately raised practical questions. Fishing vessels occasionally become disabled after mechanical failures or severe weather, but they are rarely found entirely empty without some accompanying explanation. Even when crews abandon ship during emergencies, distress calls, damaged equipment, or recovered lifeboats usually provide investigators with at least a partial understanding of what happened. In the case of the High Aim 6, the vessel itself appeared capable of remaining afloat, yet everyone aboard had vanished without leaving behind a clear sequence of events. No evidence of a violent struggle greeted investigators when they stepped aboard, yet the complete absence of the crew proved difficult to reconcile with the boat's condition. The fishing equipment remained aboard, as did much of the vessel's ordinary working gear. Cabins and operational spaces showed the expected signs of life aboard a commercial fishing boat rather than the aftermath of an obvious attack or catastrophic accident. Investigators did not encounter widespread destruction, extensive bloodshed, or physical damage pointing decisively toward one explanation over another. The absence of visible violence quickly became one of the defining features of the investigation. Many maritime mysteries become easier to classify once investigators identify unmistakable signs of piracy, mutiny, collision, or severe weather damage. Here, those indicators were largely absent. The High Aim 6 presented authorities with a functioning fishing vessel that seemed to have lost only the people responsible for operating it. Almost every clue that normally anchors a maritime investigation was either missing, incomplete, or impossible to verify with confidence. There were no confirmed eyewitnesses describing the crew's final known activities. No verified distress message established the nature of any emergency. The available documentation failed to provide investigators with a precise timeline showing when the vessel had become abandoned. Without these essential reference points, even basic questions became difficult to answer. Investigators first needed to determine not simply what had happened, but where and when the mystery had actually begun. Unlike merchant ships following established commercial routes, fishing vessels often adjust their positions in response to changing conditions at sea. They may alter course to follow fish stocks, avoid poor weather, or coordinate with other vessels engaged in similar operations. These routine changes complicate later investigations because they reduce the certainty associated with the vessel's expected location on any given day. By the time the High Aim 6 was discovered, reconstructing its exact movements required investigators to rely upon incomplete records rather than continuous observation. Following the vessel's last known movements soon revealed how quickly certainty disappears once a fishing boat passes through multiple national jurisdictions. Although the High Aim 6 was Taiwanese, the area in which it operated brought the interests of several countries into consideration. International waters rarely belong entirely to one investigative authority, meaning that evidence collected by one nation may need to be compared with records held by another. Each agency involved worked within its own legal responsibilities, but no single organisation possessed a complete picture from the beginning. This jurisdictional complexity distinguished the case from many earlier maritime mysteries. When an incident occurs within clearly defined territorial waters, responsibility generally falls to one national authority. The High Aim 6 instead occupied a maritime landscape where fishing fleets from numerous countries routinely operated, creating overlapping responsibilities that complicated efforts to establish a complete timeline. Investigators could exchange information, but each relied upon evidence gathered under different circumstances and according to different priorities. Authorities in several countries ultimately examined different parts of the mystery, each working with information that was substantial on its own but incomplete as a whole. Australian officials documented the condition of the vessel after its discovery, while Taiwanese authorities sought to understand the vessel's operational history, ownership and crew. Other regional considerations emerged because of where the fishing boat had likely travelled before drifting into Australian waters. The investigation gradually expanded across national boundaries, yet the broader it became, the more apparent it was that crucial information had already been lost. The sea itself contributed to these difficulties. Ocean currents rarely preserve evidence in the place where events originally occurred. Lifeboats, floating debris, or personal belongings can travel enormous distances before being discovered, if they are discovered at all. Even weather records, though valuable, cannot reconstruct the countless small decisions made aboard a vessel responding to changing conditions. Every day that passed before the High Aim 6 was found increased the likelihood that important evidence had dispersed beyond recovery. Remarkably little physical evidence pointed investigators toward a single sequence of events, despite careful examination of the abandoned boat. No obvious mechanical failure clearly explained why an experienced fishing crew would leave their vessel behind. Likewise, no catastrophic structural damage demonstrated that remaining aboard had become impossible. The boat itself survived well enough to drift into Australian waters, leaving investigators to ask why the crew had not survived alongside it. The lack of definitive physical clues encouraged consideration of several different possibilities. Severe weather naturally formed part of the discussion, because commercial fishing vessels frequently encounter rough seas during extended voyages. A sudden emergency might have forced the crew onto the deck under dangerous conditions, increasing the possibility of accidental falls overboard or unsuccessful rescue attempts. Yet investigators found no direct evidence confirming that extreme weather alone accounted for the disappearance. Piracy also entered the conversation because attacks on fishing vessels have occurred in various parts of the world. However, the condition of the High Aim 6 did not clearly support such a conclusion. Investigators documented no unmistakable signs of armed confrontation, nor did the vessel display the extensive disruption often associated with violent seizures. While piracy could not be dismissed outright, the available evidence did not strongly favour it over competing explanations. Mechanical difficulties represented another possibility. Fishing vessels operate continuously under demanding conditions, placing considerable strain on engines, navigation systems, and other essential equipment. Even relatively minor failures can escalate if they occur far from assistance. Nevertheless, investigators were unable to identify a specific mechanical problem that satisfactorily explained why the crew disappeared, while the vessel itself remained afloat. Several explanations remained plausible throughout the inquiry, although each encountered the same unresolved gaps in the historical record. Every theory accounted for certain known facts while leaving others unanswered. Some explained how the crew may have entered the water, but struggled to explain the absence of distress signals. Others addressed the vessel's drifting condition without clarifying why no trace of those aboard was ever conclusively recovered. The investigation gradually narrowed possibilities without reaching the certainty required for a definitive conclusion. Unlike many maritime disappearances that eventually yield wreckage or survivors, this investigation reached its limits with the vessel itself. The High Aim 6 became both the primary piece of evidence and the greatest reminder of everything investigators could not establish. Without eyewitness testimony, complete navigational records, or recoverable physical evidence from the crew, authorities reached a point where additional certainty simply could not be achieved through conventional investigation. Commercial fishing continues across the same waters today, much as it did when the High Aim 6 disappeared. Thousands of vessels still leave port knowing that much of their work will occur beyond the view of coastal communities, satellites notwithstanding. Modern technology has improved communication and emergency response, yet the vastness of the Pacific still leaves room for accidents and disappearances that unfold beyond immediate observation. The case serves as a reminder that even in an era of increasingly sophisticated maritime monitoring, distance itself remains one of the ocean's greatest advantages. Decades later, the High Aim 6 continues to illustrate how an ordinary fishing voyage can evolve into a mystery that no official investigation has been able to resolve. Unlike some famous ghost ships whose stories are preserved through detailed logs, dramatic discoveries, or extensive witness testimony, this case is remembered for the remarkable scarcity of reliable information. The vessel returned, but almost everything capable of explaining its final voyage remained somewhere beyond the reach of those searching for answers. The High Aim 6 survived long enough to return without its crew, leaving behind a mystery defined not by what investigators discovered, but by everything they never could. The Ginseng, the nameless ship nobody could explain. Every ocean-going vessel leaves behind a paper trail long before it leaves a wake across the sea. From the moment a ship is built, it begins accumulating an identity through registration documents, ownership records, inspection certificates, radio call signs, and port entries that allow maritime authorities to follow its movements across international waters. Modern shipping depends as much upon documentation as it does upon engines or navigation, because every commercial vessel is expected to reveal where it has been, who owns it, and under which nation's laws it operates. When those records disappear, investigators lose more than administrative details. They lose the framework that normally allows an entire voyage to be reconstructed. For that reason, identifying an unfamiliar vessel is usually among the simplest tasks performed by maritime authorities. A ship's name can be matched against international registries, identification numbers correspond to official databases, and even routine port inspections create records that survive for years. While ships occasionally change ownership, flags, or operating companies, those transitions generally leave behind documentation linking one chapter of a vessel's life to the next. Complete anonymity is extraordinarily uncommon in modern commercial shipping, particularly for large ocean-going vessels that routinely travel through heavily monitored trade routes. Australian surveillance crews initially had little reason to believe the drifting tanker before them was anything other than another aging ship crossing regional waters. In March 2006, while conducting routine aerial patrols off the coast of Queensland, authorities spotted a large vessel drifting in the Gulf of Carpentaria. The tanker appeared weathered, but structurally intact, floating without obvious signs of immediate distress. From a distance, nothing distinguished it from countless other commercial ships operating throughout the Asia-Pacific region. Only as authorities moved closer did the situation begin to defy ordinary expectations. The vessel showed no indication that anyone remained aboard. No crew members appeared on deck, no radio communication came from the bridge, and no visible activity suggested that routine operations continued inside. Because drifting vessels are not entirely unknown in maritime operations, investigators initially approached the tanker expecting to identify mechanical problems, locate the crew, or determine whether assistance was required. Instead, they found themselves confronting a mystery that became stranger with every step. Closer inspection quickly overturned that first impression, revealing a vessel that seemed to exist without the identifying features modern shipping depends upon. The ship bore the name Ginseng, yet investigators soon discovered that this single piece of information led almost nowhere. The markings that normally accompany a commercial vessel, clear registration details, an identifiable home port, and documentation connecting the ship to recognise maritime records, were either missing, inconsistent, or could not be verified through available databases. Rather than answering questions, the vessel's appearance generated new ones. Boarding parties searched the ship systematically, expecting the bridge and accommodation spaces to provide routine operational information. Instead, the investigation revealed an unusually sparse collection of records. Essential documentation capable of establishing ownership, recent cargo, operational history, or the identities of those responsible for the vessel proved absent. Although abandoned ships often lose certain records during emergencies, investigators rarely encounter a commercial tanker whose broader history proves so difficult to establish from the evidence left aboard. Neither the bridge nor the accommodation areas provided the straightforward answers investigators expected to find aboard a ship of its size. Navigation spaces contained equipment consistent with an operational vessel, but little that clearly established its recent activities. Living quarters offered few clues about the number of people who had most recently occupied them, or when they had departed. Unlike investigations where personal belongings preserve vivid evidence of interrupted daily life, the Jianseng presented a remarkably impersonal environment. The ship felt less like a vessel abruptly abandoned during a crisis, and more like one whose history had already begun fading before investigators ever stepped aboard. Authorities also noted that the tanker carried no cargo. For a vessel of its size, this detail attracted immediate attention because commercial tankers generally exist to transport substantial quantities of fuel, oil, or other bulk liquids across international routes. An empty tanker is not inherently suspicious. Ships frequently travel without cargo while repositioning between ports. But without supporting documentation, investigators could not determine whether the Jianseng had recently completed a delivery, was en route to receive cargo, or had served an entirely different purpose. Searching for ownership soon proved more productive than searching for survivors, because almost nothing aboard established who the vessel actually belonged to. Investigators examined available maritime databases, registration records, and other official sources hoping to match the ship's name with documented ownership. Yet the results remained frustratingly incomplete. Information associated with the Jianseng failed to produce the clear administrative history expected of a commercial vessel operating in modern international waters. The lack of verifiable documentation distinguished this investigation from most maritime disappearance cases. Ordinarily, once authorities identify a vessel, they can contact owners, review maintenance records, examine previous inspection reports, and interview individuals connected with recent voyages. Those sources often reveal valuable information even when the crew themselves cannot immediately be located. In the Jianseng investigation, however, uncertainty surrounded the vessel, before questions about the crew could even be meaningfully addressed. Tracing the Jianseng's recent history became an exercise in following gaps rather than confirmed records. Every unanswered administrative question created additional uncertainty regarding the ship's operational past. Investigators could not confidently establish its recent ports of call, determine its intended destination, or reconstruct a reliable timeline leading to its discovery. The vessel had entered Australian attention carrying remarkably little of the historical evidence that usually accompanies international shipping. This absence complicated every subsequent stage of the inquiry. Without knowing where the ship had recently operated, authorities could not accurately identify which maritime agencies, ports, or shipping companies might possess additional information. Likewise, uncertainty regarding ownership made it difficult to establish who bore responsibility for reporting the vessel missing or explaining its abandonment. The investigation therefore expanded outward in search of basic facts that most maritime inquiries treat as their starting point. Questions surrounding the missing crew only deepened after authorities realized they could not confidently determine where the ship had last operated. Even the number of people most recently aboard remained uncertain because no verified crew list accompanied the vessel. Unlike passenger ships or scheduled cargo services, where manifests preserve detailed records of everyone involved in a voyage, the Jianseng offered no comparable documentation. Investigators knew the ship had once required people to operate it, yet identifying those individuals proved almost impossible. This uncertainty transformed the disappearance into something broader than the search for missing sailors. Without confirmed identities, investigators could not notify families, reconstruct professional backgrounds, or compare witness testimony describing recent voyages. The human story, normally occupying the centre of a maritime mystery, remained largely inaccessible because the administrative foundations supporting that story had effectively vanished alongside the crew themselves. Several explanations emerged as investigators compared the vessel's unusual condition with known patterns of legitimate and illicit maritime activity. One possibility suggested that the tanker may have operated as a support vessel for illegal fishing fleets working remote waters. Such operations sometimes rely upon ships capable of transporting fuel and supplies, allowing fishing boats to remain at sea for extended periods without returning to port. If the Jianseng had fulfilled such a role, its limited documentation might have reflected deliberate efforts to reduce official scrutiny. Other observers considered whether the vessel had been abandoned following mechanical problems or commercial difficulties. Aging ships occasionally become economically impractical to repair, leading owners to dispose of them through legal scrapping or, in rare instances, unlawful abandonment. Yet investigators found insufficient evidence to demonstrate that the Jianseng had simply been discarded after becoming financially burdensome. The available facts supported possibility rather than certainty. Insurance fraud also appeared in public discussion because abandoned commercial vessels have occasionally featured in fraudulent schemes throughout maritime history. Such operations typically involve deliberate deception intended to generate financial compensation. However, no publicly available evidence conclusively connected the Jianseng to such activity, and investigators never established that an identifiable owner had orchestrated the vessel's abandonment for insurance purposes. Each possibility accounted for certain details while leaving the central mystery of the Jianseng stubbornly unresolved. Illegal operations might explain limited documentation, but not necessarily the complete absence of the crew. Mechanical problems could justify abandonment under specific circumstances, but failed to clarify why the ship's broader identity remained so difficult to verify. Likewise, commercial explanations addressed aspects of ownership without accounting for the disappearance of everyone responsible for operating the vessel. Every theory illuminated part of the picture while leaving substantial portions in darkness. Modern merchant ships rarely disappear from official records, making this abandoned tanker an exceptional challenge for maritime investigators. International shipping has become increasingly dependent upon coordinated documentation, electronic tracking, and multinational regulation designed to reduce uncertainty regarding vessels operating across global trade routes. Although no system is entirely immune to fraud or administrative failure, the Jianseng demonstrated that significant gaps can still emerge despite those safeguards. The case also illustrated an important distinction between physical evidence and historical evidence. The ship itself survived long enough to be examined in detail, providing investigators with direct access to its structure, equipment, and condition. Yet physical access alone could not replace the administrative history that had apparently vanished. Without reliable documentation, even careful inspection reached limits beyond which conventional investigation could not proceed. Nearly 20 years later, the Jianseng continues to occupy an unusual place among ghost ships because its identity remains almost as mysterious as the fate of its crew. Most abandoned vessels become famous because investigators know exactly what they are while struggling to explain why they were deserted. The Jianseng reversed that pattern. Before anyone could fully investigate the disappearance, they first had to determine what exactly had been found drifting in Australian waters, and even that question has never received a completely satisfying answer. The Jianseng was discovered as an empty tanker, but the greatest mystery may be that no one has ever fully explained who the ship truly was before it began drifting alone. The SV Bellamika, the luxury yacht that had no owner. Few sights at sea inspire a greater sense of ease than a well-kept luxury yacht resting quietly on calm water. Unlike commercial freighters built for efficiency or fishing vessels designed for demanding work, luxury yachts are often associated with leisure, privacy, and carefully planned voyages along some of the world's most scenic coastlines. Their polished decks and elegant interiors suggest comfort rather than crisis, making them an unlikely setting for maritime investigations. Yet appearances can be deceptive, and on rare occasions a vessel designed for relaxation becomes the centre of questions that neither its condition nor its surroundings can immediately answer. That expectation gave way to uncertainty when Italian authorities boarded an elegant vessel and found no one waiting to greet them. In August 2006, the yacht later identified as the Bellamika was discovered drifting off the northeastern coast of Sardinia. From the outside, the vessel appeared remarkably ordinary. It was afloat, structurally sound, and showed no obvious signs of having endured violent weather or a collision. Nothing about its condition suggested an emergency severe enough to explain why nobody remained aboard. Nevertheless, repeated attempts to locate occupants produced only silence. The location of the discovery added to the intrigue. Sardinia has long attracted recreational sailors, private yachts, and luxury vessels from across Europe during the summer months. The surrounding waters are among the busiest leisure cruising areas in the Mediterranean, making an abandoned yacht particularly unusual. In an environment where boats routinely anchor in secluded bays before continuing their journeys, an empty vessel might initially appear to be only temporarily unattended. It was only after authorities confirmed that no one could be found aboard that the incident began attracting wider attention. Nothing inside immediately suggested panic or violence, yet the complete absence of people transformed an ordinary inspection into an international curiosity. Investigators found personal belongings still aboard, along with clothing, food, and other items, indicating that the yacht had recently been occupied. The interior reflected the comforts expected aboard a privately owned vessel, rather than the aftermath of a maritime disaster. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no widespread damage, and no evidence that the yacht had been hastily abandoned in response to an immediately visible threat. The contrast between the yacht's condition and its emptiness naturally encouraged speculation. Throughout maritime history, abandoned vessels have often owed their mystery to the absence of clear physical evidence. In the case of the Bella Mica, the surroundings seemed almost too peaceful. The sea had preserved the yacht itself while offering little explanation for why those aboard were no longer there. Investigators were left examining not a wreck or a sinking vessel, but an intact floating home whose occupants had seemingly disappeared without leaving behind an obvious narrative. Reports of the discovery spread rapidly through newspapers and television broadcasts, where the abandoned yacht was soon portrayed as a modern ghost ship. Early accounts emphasized the vessel's elegant appearance and the unexplained absence of anyone aboard, details that naturally captured public imagination. As news crossed Europe, the story evolved beyond a routine maritime investigation into something far more mysterious. Headlines highlighted unanswered questions, while speculation quickly began filling the spaces where verified information remained limited. Among the earliest rumours were suggestions that the yacht had been connected to organised crime, wealthy fugitives, or clandestine intelligence operations. Others imagined that its occupants had fled suddenly after encountering some unknown danger at sea. These ideas gained attention not because investigators had uncovered supporting evidence, but because the discovery itself seemed to invite extraordinary explanations. A luxurious vessel abandoned without an obvious cause fit comfortably into the long tradition of ghost ship legends, encouraging stories that often travelled much faster than official findings. Public fascination grew even faster than the verified facts, allowing rumours to fill the many gaps left by the initial reports. This pattern is not uncommon in unusual maritime cases. Whenever an investigation begins with incomplete information, speculation often develops independently of the evidence, especially when dramatic images accompany the story. Photographs of the Bella Mica drifting unattended proved compelling enough that many people encountered the mystery first through sensational headlines, rather than through the measured progress of the investigation itself. Investigators responded by examining the yacht's registration, ownership records, and recent movements in an effort to separate evidence from speculation. Unlike cases involving unidentified ships, authorities were ultimately able to establish information about the vessel that gradually clarified several of the most persistent rumours. As records were reviewed and inquiries continued, the investigation shifted away from extraordinary theories and toward a more conventional effort to understand the yacht's recent history. Official findings indicated that the vessel had an identifiable owner, despite widespread early claims that it belonged to no one. Reports connected the yacht to a businessman from Luxembourg, and investigators concluded that the dramatic image of a completely ownerless ghost ship did not accurately reflect the available evidence. Likewise, some widely circulated claims concerning mysterious cargo or secret operations failed to withstand closer examination. The further investigators progressed, the more apparent it became that many of the story's most sensational elements had originated outside the official inquiry. As more information emerged, several of the most dramatic theories began to lose credibility, even though the unusual circumstances of the discovery remained undeniable. Authorities determined that aspects of the case were less mysterious than initially portrayed, yet certain questions continued to attract discussion. Why had the yacht been left unattended in the first place? What sequence of events had led to its abandonment before it drifted into the path of investigators? Although later explanations reduced the scope of the mystery, they did not entirely eliminate public curiosity. The distinction between documented fact and enduring legend became one of the most interesting features of the Bella Mica story. Many ghost ships remain famous because investigators never identify those responsible or reconstruct the final voyage. Here, the vessel itself gradually became better understood, while the public memory of the incident remained shaped by the dramatic first reports. The image of an elegant yacht drifting silently through Mediterranean waters proved far more lasting than the subsequent corrections that followed. The investigation ultimately revealed a story that was more grounded than the legend surrounding it, but no less intriguing for those who first encountered the abandoned vessel. Maritime authorities regularly emphasize the importance of verifying evidence before accepting extraordinary explanations, and the Bella Mica illustrates why that caution matters. Initial appearances suggested an inexplicable ghost ship, yet patient investigation demonstrated that reality often proves more complex than the first headlines allow. Even so, complexity does not necessarily diminish fascination. Instead, it shifts attention from sensational possibilities toward the quieter challenge of understanding how ordinary events can produce extraordinary impressions. Today, the Bella Mica continues to be remembered because its discovery demonstrated how quickly mystery can grow when appearances invite more questions than immediate answers. Unlike other abandoned vessels whose enduring puzzles rest entirely upon missing crews or vanished logbooks, this yacht occupies a different place in maritime history. Its legacy lies not only in the circumstances under which it was found, but also in the remarkable speed with which uncertainty became legend. Long after investigators clarified many of the facts, the image of the empty yacht continued to drift through books, documentaries, and conversations about ghost ships, reminding audiences that the stories surrounding an investigation can sometimes become almost as enduring as the evidence itself. The SV Bella Mica drifted into public memory as much through the stories it inspired as through the unanswered moments that first left its decks completely empty. The Orang Medan, the distress call that ended in silence. Not every maritime mystery begins with a ship, because some begin with nothing more than a story that refuses to disappear. Throughout the history of seafaring, countless incidents have vanished beneath the waves without leaving behind enough evidence for future generations to examine. Some became official records preserved in naval archives and shipping registers, while others survived only through scattered publications, second-hand accounts, and retellings that gradually blurred the line between documented history and enduring legend. Few cases illustrate that uncertainty more clearly than the story of the Orang Medan, a ship whose alleged final voyage remains as difficult to verify as it is impossible to forget. Maritime folklore has always occupied an unusual space between history and storytelling. Sailors have long exchanged accounts of strange encounters at sea, some eventually confirmed by later evidence, and others remaining impossible to prove. Unlike events witnessed on land, incidents in the open ocean often unfold far beyond independent observation, allowing even extraordinary claims to persist when no physical evidence survives. For historians, the challenge is not simply deciding whether a story is believable, but determining how much of it can actually be traced to reliable contemporary sources. Few distress messages have inspired as much debate as the one later attributed to a merchant vessel called the Orang Medan. According to the version most widely circulated over the decades, radio operators intercepted a series of increasingly alarming transmissions from a ship somewhere in the waters of Southeast Asia during the late 1940s. The message reportedly described a crew lying dead aboard the vessel, before concluding with a final sentence that has become inseparable from the legend itself. Yet despite its fame, the original transmission has never been independently verified through surviving radio logs or official communication records. The wording of the reported distress call varies slightly depending on the source consulted, but later accounts generally describe a sequence in which the operator first announced that officers and crew had died, followed by a brief statement indicating that he too was dying. The abrupt ending of the transmission became one of the story's defining features, suggesting that communication ceased at the precise moment the final survivor succumbed to whatever had overtaken the ship. It is an image both dramatic and unsettling, one that has helped the legend endure despite persistent uncertainty surrounding its origins. Radio operators who allegedly received the transmission were said to have heard words that immediately suggested a disaster unfolding beyond the horizon. Nearby vessels reportedly altered course in an effort to locate the source of the distress signal, eventually identifying the Orang Medan adrift at sea. Because no verified official rescue report has ever been produced, historians remain cautious when describing this portion of the narrative. Nevertheless, the alleged boarding of the vessel forms the central episode repeated throughout nearly every version of the story. The descriptions of what rescuers supposedly discovered have become some of the most memorable images in maritime folklore. Later accounts claim that every member of the crew was found dead where they had fallen, scattered across the bridge, engine room, and decks without obvious physical injuries. The captain was reportedly discovered on the bridge, while the radio operator was said to have remained at his equipment after sending the final distress message. Many versions further describe the bodies as wearing expressions of extreme fear, their faces turned upward as though reacting to something unseen during their final moments. No contemporary evidence has conclusively confirmed these descriptions, and historians generally emphasize that they originate from later published accounts rather than verified investigative records. Even so, the consistency with which these details reappear across books, magazines, and documentaries has given them remarkable staying power. The image of an entire crew apparently dying simultaneously without visible wounds has proven difficult to separate from the legend itself, even as researchers continue questioning the historical reliability of the narrative. By the time rescuers reportedly reached the vessel, the mystery had already taken a far darker turn. According to the traditional account, members of the boarding party soon noticed signs that the ship itself was becoming dangerously unstable. Smoke was allegedly observed rising from below deck, prompting an immediate evacuation. Moments after everyone returned to the rescue vessel, the Orang Medan was said to have exploded before sinking beneath the sea, taking with it nearly every opportunity for investigators to conduct a thorough examination. This reported destruction occupies a crucial place within the story because it conveniently explains the absence of physical evidence. If the ship truly exploded and disappeared before investigators could inspect it in detail, then later generations would naturally be forced to rely upon eyewitness testimony alone. At the same time, that very lack of surviving evidence makes independent historical verification extraordinarily difficult. The disappearance of the vessel removes the possibility of examining the wreck, reviewing onboard documents, or comparing the physical evidence with later claims. Almost everything known about the alleged incident depends upon what was written after the ship was said to have disappeared. Unlike many maritime disasters that generated official investigations, newspaper coverage, insurance records, and government inquiries, the Orang Medan exists within a far more fragmented documentary history. The most frequently cited accounts appeared years after the supposed event, rather than immediately following it, creating uncertainty about where the information originated and how faithfully it reflected any genuine incident. Some versions of the story point to articles published in Europe during the early 1950s, while others reference later maritime magazines that repeated or expanded upon earlier reports. As the tale spread internationally, each retelling introduced subtle differences regarding dates, locations, ship specifications, and even the sequence of events. These variations do not necessarily prove the story false, but they complicate efforts to identify a single authoritative source describing what allegedly occurred. Looking back through the surviving publications reveals how uncertain the historical foundation of the story actually is. Researchers attempting to trace the legend often encounter references that lead not to official archives, but to other secondary publications, each citing previous accounts without establishing an unbroken chain back to contemporary evidence. This circular pattern has frustrated historians seeking to determine whether the story originated from an authentic maritime incident or gradually evolved through repeated retelling. One of the most frequently discussed questions concerns the ship itself. Researchers have searched maritime records in an effort to confirm the existence of a merchant vessel named Orang Medan, yet no universally accepted documentation has resolved the issue. Some historians argue that gaps in post-war shipping records leave room for uncertainty, while others contend that the absence of clear registration evidence weakens the historical case considerably. The debate continues because neither position has produced definitive proof capable of ending the discussion. Modern historians continue to examine newspaper articles, maritime publications, and registry records in search of independent confirmation. Rather than approaching the story as a simple ghost ship tale, many researchers now treat it as an exercise in historical source analysis. They compare publication dates, evaluate the reliability of cited witnesses, and distinguish between information supported by evidence and details that appear only after years of repetition. This process has not solved the mystery, but it has clarified the difference between documented history and enduring folklore. Separate questions gradually emerge once the available evidence is examined with greater care than the legend usually receives. The first asks whether an incident resembling the Orang Medan story actually occurred somewhere in Southeast Asian waters. The second asks whether later authors combined factual elements with dramatic embellishment as the story circulated internationally. A third possibility is that the legend drew inspiration from more than one maritime incident, eventually merging different reports into a single narrative remembered under one name. Even if some version of the event did occur, the reported deaths have inspired numerous attempts at explanation. Among the most frequently discussed possibilities is the accidental release of hazardous cargo, including toxic chemicals capable of producing rapid poisoning under confined conditions. Others have suggested carbon monoxide or other dangerous gases accumulating within the ship after mechanical problems. These ideas remain speculative because the vessel itself, if it existed as described, was allegedly lost before any forensic investigation could take place. Alternative explanations focused less on the event itself and more on the evolution of maritime storytelling. Legends often become more dramatic as they are repeated, particularly when original documentation is incomplete or unavailable. Details that capture the imagination, such as frozen expressions of terror or mysterious final messages, can become firmly attached to a story even when their historical origins remain uncertain. The Orang Medan demonstrates how maritime folklore can preserve powerful imagery long after confidence in its factual basis begins to erode. Even without universal agreement over its authenticity, the tale has continued to influence books, documentaries, and discussions of ghost ships around the world. Unlike mysteries that survive because evidence remains locked beneath the sea, this one persists because the historical record itself refuses to provide a definitive answer. Each generation returns to the same scattered publications, hoping to discover overlooked documentation or forgotten archival material capable of confirming or disproving the legend once and for all. The Orang Medan remains one of the few ghost ships whose greatest mystery may be whether its final voyage ever unfolded exactly as the legend remembers it. The Beichimo, the Arctic ship that would not stay lost. Ice does not always destroy what it captures, because in the Arctic it can preserve, carry and release a ship years after it was expected to vanish. Across the polar seas, drifting pack ice behaves less like a permanent barrier than a slow-moving landscape, constantly breaking apart, freezing together again, and carrying anything trapped within it across enormous distances. For centuries, explorers learned that a vessel caught in the ice might disappear beyond the horizon without actually sinking, only to emerge months or even years later when changing seasons loosened the frozen grip. Few ships demonstrated that remarkable reality more vividly than one trading vessel whose story unfolded not through a single disappearance, but through an astonishing series of returns. The Arctic has always operated according to rules unfamiliar to those accustomed to warmer oceans. Storms certainly threaten ships there, but ice often presents an even greater challenge because it changes continuously throughout the year. Thick floes can imprison a vessel without immediately crushing it, while shifting currents gradually transport both ice and ship across remote stretches of ocean. A vessel that appears permanently lost during one season may unexpectedly emerge hundreds of miles away after months of drifting, creating the illusion that it has simply wandered back into the world on its own. Long before it became one of the world's most famous ghost ships, the Beichimo served as an ordinary cargo vessel supporting trade across the Canadian Arctic. Originally built in Sweden in 1914 under the name Ångermanälven, the steel-hulled steamship was later acquired by the Hudson's Bay Company and renamed Beichimo. Its purpose was practical rather than adventurous. The ship transported supplies, equipment, and trade goods to isolated northern communities while carrying valuable furs southward at the end of each season. Year after year, it followed demanding Arctic routes where careful navigation and experience mattered as much as the ship's engineering. Operating in northern waters required accepting risks that crews elsewhere rarely encountered. The shipping season remained short, leaving little margin for delay before advancing sea ice began closing traditional routes. Captains constantly balanced commercial obligations against the changing conditions around them, knowing that an unexpected cold spell could transform open water into an impassable frozen barrier within days. Despite these hazards, the Beichimo completed numerous successful voyages, earning a reputation as a dependable working vessel rather than an extraordinary one. Everything changed when early winter ice closed around the ship before it could complete another routine voyage. In October 1931, while navigating near the coast of Alaska after completing trading operations, the Beichimo became trapped in pack ice. At first, there was little reason to believe the situation was beyond recovery. Arctic vessels had occasionally survived similar conditions by waiting for weather or shifting currents to create new passages. The crew remained aboard while hoping that the ice would eventually release the ship. As the weeks passed, however, conditions steadily deteriorated. Strong winds, freezing temperatures, and increasingly unstable ice complicated every effort to free the vessel. Recognizing that the situation might not improve before the onset of the Arctic winter, the crew prepared for the possibility that abandoning the ship would become necessary. Eventually, most of those aboard were evacuated by air to safety. an operation that itself reflected the seriousness of the circumstances facing everyone involved. Those forced to leave the vessel believed the Arctic would soon finish what the freezing sea had already begun. A steel ship locked within shifting pack ice ordinarily faced an uncertain future, and many expected the immense pressure generated by moving ice to crush the hull long before another shipping season arrived. Before departing completely, company representatives even removed portions of the cargo and equipment that might later prove useful elsewhere, assuming the vessel's working life had effectively ended. Then, something unexpected happened. After a powerful blizzard swept across the region, observers returned expecting to find wreckage or perhaps no ship at all. Instead, the Beichimo had vanished from the location where it had last been seen. At first, the disappearance appeared to confirm the assumption that the vessel had finally sunk beneath the ice. Yet that conclusion lasted only briefly. Instead, the Beichimo reappeared, beginning a pattern that would become almost impossible to explain through ordinary expectation alone. Not long afterward, the ship was sighted again, still afloat and drifting through Arctic waters without anyone aboard. The vessel had escaped the ice rather than being destroyed by it, continuing its journey under the combined influence of currents, winds, and floating sea ice. The abandoned ship had survived conditions that many believed would inevitably claim it. The decision was made to salvage additional cargo from the drifting vessel, while the opportunity still existed. A small party managed to recover valuable furs and other supplies before worsening weather once again interrupted operations. Then another storm arrived, and when conditions improved, the Beichimo had disappeared for a second time. Once again, the Arctic seemed to have concealed the ship without destroying it. Over the following years, hunters, traders, explorers, and passing crews continued reporting encounters with the abandoned vessel in remarkably different places. These sightings gradually transformed the Beichimo from an unfortunate commercial loss into one of the Arctic's most remarkable maritime mysteries. Rather than remaining where it had been abandoned, the ship appeared repeatedly across different stretches of northern waters, sometimes months apart and sometimes after much longer intervals. Several encounters came from people who had little reason to invent such reports. Inuit hunters described seeing the drifting vessel while travelling across the ice. Crews aboard other ships occasionally encountered the empty steamship moving silently through remote waters. Explorers operating in the Arctic likewise reported unexpected meetings with the abandoned vessel, often describing the strange experience of finding a fully intact ship where no crew could possibly have remained after so many years. Each sighting reinforced the same extraordinary impression. The Beichimo appeared weathered but still recognizable, its steel hull continuing to withstand conditions that had destroyed countless other vessels. Time gradually left its mark through rust, damage, and exposure, yet the ship persisted. Unlike ghost ships carried briefly by currents before eventually sinking, the Beichimo seemed to establish a recurring presence across the Arctic itself. No single sighting completely resolved where the ship had travelled between appearances. One report would place it near Alaska, while another emerged from a different part of the Arctic months or years later. The distances involved reflected the complex interaction of sea ice, ocean currents, and seasonal thawing. Because much of the region remained sparsely populated, the vessel could spend long periods drifting unseen before unexpectedly crossing paths with another expedition. Ocean currents, drifting sea ice, and the strength of the ship itself offer part of the explanation, although not every question disappears so easily. The Beichimo possessed a steel hull designed to withstand demanding northern conditions, making it significantly more resilient than many earlier wooden vessels. Combined with the slow movement of Arctic pack ice and powerful regional currents, those characteristics help explain how the ship survived far longer than initially expected. From a scientific perspective, the vessel's continued existence was improbable, but not impossible. Even so, understanding how the Beichimo survived does not fully explain why it seemed to appear with such remarkable persistence. Each new sighting revived hopes that someone might finally recover the drifting vessel, or at least determine its condition more thoroughly. Yet every opportunity proved temporary. Before organised salvage efforts could succeed, the ship would once again disappear into the immense and unpredictable landscape of the Arctic. Eventually, even the repeated sightings came to an end, leaving historians to wonder when the wandering ship finally met its fate. One of the last widely cited confirmed encounters occurred in 1969. when the abandoned vessel was reportedly observed drifting through Arctic waters nearly 4 decades after its crew had left it behind. After that, reliable sightings ceased. Whether the Beichimo finally sank beneath the ice, broke apart during severe weather, or remains hidden somewhere beneath Arctic waters has never been conclusively established. Despite occasional modern expeditions attempting to locate the wreck, no confirmed discovery has resolved the mystery. Advances in satellite imagery, marine technology, and Arctic exploration have made it easier to survey remote regions than ever before, yet the vastness of the polar environment continues to challenge even the most determined searchers. If the remains of the Beichimo still exist, they lie somewhere within one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Unlike nearly every other abandoned vessel discussed in maritime history, the Beichimo became famous not for a single disappearance, but for an extraordinary refusal to remain lost. Rather than ending with the crew's departure in 1931, its story continued for decades through unexpected encounters that blurred the boundary between documented history and maritime folklore. Every reported sighting reminded observers that the Arctic operates according to rhythms unlike those of any other ocean, where a ship can vanish into ice, reappear years later, and disappear once more before anyone has time to understand how it survived. The Beichimo kept returning long after everyone expected the Arctic to claim it, leaving behind a mystery measured not by one disappearance, but by every unexpected reappearance that followed. The Zebrina, the cargo ship found adrift during World War I. War changes the meaning of disappearance because in times of conflict, even ordinary silence can seem expected. During the First World War, merchant vessels crossed dangerous waters, knowing that every voyage carried risks extending far beyond weather or mechanical failure. Naval blockades, drifting mines, and German submarines transformed familiar shipping routes into unpredictable front lines, where ships could vanish without warning. News of another missing vessel rarely seemed extraordinary in isolation, yet every so often a case emerged that resisted even the harsh logic of wartime, raising questions that could not be answered simply by pointing to the conflict itself. By 1917, the English Channel and the surrounding waters had become some of the most closely watched yet most hazardous stretches of sea in Europe. Commercial shipping remained essential despite the dangers, supplying industries, transporting raw materials, and supporting economies struggling under the pressure of a prolonged war. Captains understood that every successful crossing depended not only upon seamanship, but also upon avoiding threats that often remained invisible until it was too late. Even so, the destruction left by mines or submarine attacks usually followed recognizable patterns, allowing investigators to reconstruct at least part of what had occurred. Against that backdrop of constant maritime danger, a small British schooner departed on what should have been another routine commercial voyage. The Zebrina, a sailing vessel built in 1873, had spent decades carrying cargo through coastal waters. Unlike the large steamships increasingly dominating international trade, the schooner represented an older generation of commercial vessels that continued performing dependable work along established routes. Its final documented voyage began in October 1917, when it departed from Falmouth, England, carrying a cargo of coal destined for the French port of Saint-Brieuc. Nothing about the voyage initially suggested that it would become part of maritime history. The cargo was ordinary, the destination well known, and the route familiar to experienced crews operating in the region. Although wartime conditions demanded caution, merchant vessels continued making similar crossings whenever circumstances allowed. For those aboard the Zebrina, the journey likely appeared to be another demanding but routine passage through waters where vigilance had become part of everyday life. Days later, the vessel was found drifting off the coast of France under circumstances that immediately distinguished it from countless other wartime losses. French authorities discovered the schooner near Cherbourg, still afloat and carrying its cargo. The sails remained set, and the ship itself appeared largely intact. Yet despite the vessel's surprisingly good condition, there was no sign of the captain or the rest of the crew. The Zebrina had become an abandoned ship without displaying the destruction investigators normally associated with wartime disasters. The absence of the crew immediately shifted attention away from the condition of the vessel itself. Merchant ships damaged by explosions often bore unmistakable evidence of violence, while survivors or debris helped reconstruct the sequence of events. Here, investigators faced an entirely different situation. The ship had survived the voyage well enough to remain afloat, but the people responsible for sailing it had disappeared completely. Without witnesses or confirmed survivors, even the simplest questions became unexpectedly difficult to answer. Neither the condition of the ship nor the cargo aboard matched what investigators usually encountered after mines, storms, or submarine attacks. The cargo of coal remained where it had been loaded, indicating that robbery or opportunistic salvage had not taken place before the vessel was discovered. Equally important, no reports described catastrophic structural damage capable of explaining an immediate abandonment. Had the schooner struck a mine or suffered a violent explosion, investigators would ordinarily expect substantial physical evidence supporting that conclusion. The state of the rigging also complicated the picture. Contemporary descriptions indicate that the vessel remained sufficiently intact to be taken under control after its discovery, suggesting that it had not endured the kind of overwhelming damage normally associated with sinking ships. This distinction mattered because investigators were not attempting to explain why the Sabrina had been lost. Instead, they were attempting to explain why an apparently serviceable vessel had been left behind. Military authorities naturally considered whether the First World War itself held the answer, yet the available evidence refused to fit neatly into any familiar explanation. One possibility centered on German submarine activity, which had dramatically intensified during the war. U-boats regularly intercepted merchant vessels, sometimes sinking them immediately and at other times allowing crews to abandon ship before destroying the vessel. Such encounters were well documented throughout the conflict and represented one of the greatest dangers facing commercial shipping. At first glance, enemy action appeared to offer a reasonable explanation. If the Sabrina had encountered a submarine, the crew might have been ordered into lifeboats before the vessel was left adrift. Yet this theory introduced new difficulties. German naval records examined by later researchers have not provided definitive confirmation that a U-boat intercepted the schooner during its final voyage. While the absence of surviving documentation cannot entirely exclude the possibility, neither does it provide the clear evidence historians would hope to find when reconstructing a wartime incident. Another suggestion proposed that the crew abandoned the vessel after mistakenly believing it faced imminent danger. Merchant sailors operating under wartime conditions knew that hesitation during an emergency could prove fatal. Smoke, unexplained sounds, or concerns about hidden damage might have prompted a rapid evacuation if those aboard believed an explosion or sinking was unavoidable. However, no surviving evidence identifies a specific emergency capable of producing such a decision aboard the Sabrina. Storms likewise appear insufficient to account for the mystery. Severe weather certainly challenged sailing vessels in the English Channel, but storms generally left visible traces upon ships that survived them. Damaged rigging, broken masts, or signs of flooding often provided investigators with valuable clues. The available descriptions of the Sabrina do not indicate the sort of widespread storm damage expected after a weather-related abandonment, leaving this explanation uncertain as well. Official records from both sides of the conflict have since been examined in an effort to determine whether the schooner's final voyage intersected with documented naval operations. Historians studying the case have compared shipping records, wartime reports, and surviving military documentation in search of any event capable of explaining the disappearance. Yet the evidence remains remarkably limited. The historical record establishes that the ship departed with its cargo and was later discovered abandoned, but it offers little certainty regarding what happened in the intervening days. This scarcity of evidence reflects the broader realities of wartime record-keeping. The First World War generated enormous quantities of military documentation, yet not every incident received detailed investigation, particularly when immediate strategic concerns demanded greater attention elsewhere. Smaller merchant vessels could disappear into the background of a conflict defined by much larger naval engagements. As a result, some mysteries remained unresolved not because investigators ignored them, but because the available evidence never reached the level necessary for firm conclusions. Even after historians compared wartime reports, shipping records, and later research, several essential questions remained unanswered. Why did every member of the crew leave a vessel that still carried its cargo? If they evacuated into lifeboats, what became of them afterward? Why was no conclusive record produced identifying the event that forced experienced sailors to abandon a schooner capable of remaining afloat until its discovery? Each unanswered question reinforces the unusual nature of the case. Unlike many maritime disappearances, the mystery of the Sabrina is not sustained by dramatic claims or sensational legends. There are no widely repeated stories of supernatural encounters, cryptic messages, or impossible discoveries. Instead, the uncertainty arises from the quiet absence of information. A working cargo vessel completed almost its entire voyage before appearing without the people who had guided it across dangerous waters, and history has preserved remarkably little explaining how that transition occurred. Unlike so many vessels remembered for sinking beneath the waves, the Sabrina survived long enough to leave behind a mystery that history has never fully resolved. The schooner emerged from one of the most destructive conflicts in modern history, carrying the very cargo it had departed with, yet without the crew whose knowledge might have explained everything. In an era when countless ships disappeared amid violence and chaos, the Sabrina became memorable precisely because it failed to resemble the wartime tragedies surrounding it, standing instead as a rare case where the vessel endured while its people simply vanished from the historical record. The Sabrina emerged from one of history's deadliest wars without its crew, leaving behind a mystery that still refuses to resemble any ordinary wartime loss. The Teignmouth Electron, a yacht left adrift across the Atlantic. No place on Earth isolates a person quite like the open ocean when there is no one else aboard to witness what unfolds. A solo sailor cannot share responsibility, compare observations, or rely on another voice when uncertainty begins to grow. Every decision, from altering course to interpreting weather, rests with a single individual whose thoughts remain unknown unless they are written down or transmitted by radio. If contact is lost, the sea preserves only fragments of the journey, leaving investigators to reconstruct an entire voyage from whatever the sailor chose to leave behind. Long-distance ocean racing magnifies that isolation in ways few other pursuits can. Competitors spend months separated from land, navigating immense stretches of water where assistance may be hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Success depends not only upon technical skill and endurance, but also upon the ability to withstand prolonged solitude without losing judgment. During the late 1960s, one new competition challenged sailors to attempt something no organised race had previously required: a non-stop solo circumnavigation of the globe. Against that immense solitude, a new round-the-world sailing race promised to reward endurance, navigation, and extraordinary self-reliance. The Sunday Times Golden Globe Race, announced in 1968, offered prizes for the first sailor to complete a non-stop solo voyage around the world and for the fastest successful circumnavigation. The event immediately captured public attention because it combined exploration, competition, and personal endurance on an unprecedented scale. Several experienced sailors entered, each preparing vessels capable of surviving one of the longest and most demanding voyages imaginable. Donald Crowhurst entered the competition with ambition that far exceeded the preparation of both his yacht and his circumstances. A British businessman and amateur sailor, Crowhurst possessed considerable intelligence and enthusiasm, but he lacked the extensive blue water experience of several other competitors. Even so, he committed himself to the race aboard a trimaran named Teignmouth Electron, a vessel built specifically for the challenge. Behind the excitement surrounding the departure lay significant financial pressure. Crowhurst had invested heavily in the project, secured sponsorship, and entered agreements that made withdrawing from the race increasingly difficult without risking severe personal and financial consequences. The Teignmouth Electron departed England in October 1968 as one of several yachts beginning the ambitious circumnavigation. At first, the voyage appeared to follow the same uncertain path faced by every competitor. Radio communications reported progress, while observers ashore attempted to follow the widely separated participants through occasional updates. Yet unlike traditional sailing races held within sight of spectators, this competition unfolded almost entirely beyond direct observation. Once each yacht disappeared beyond the horizon, only intermittent communications connected the sailors to the outside world. Gradually, the challenges confronting Crowhurst extended far beyond damaged equipment or difficult weather. Problems with the trimaran became increasingly apparent during the early stages of the voyage. Reports indicate that the yacht suffered mechanical and structural difficulties that raised serious concerns about its ability to survive the Southern Ocean, widely regarded as one of the most dangerous environments on Earth for small sailing vessels. Continuing toward the Great Capes under those conditions carried enormous risk, while abandoning the race threatened financial ruin and public humiliation. Faced with those realities, Crowhurst made a decision that would shape every remaining stage of the voyage. Rather than continuing on the expected route around the globe, Historians generally believe that he remained in the Atlantic while transmitting misleading position reports suggesting that he had progressed much farther than he actually had. Because communications from competitors were necessarily limited, and independent verification was difficult, the deception continued for months without immediate detection. The false reports created the appearance of a successful circumnavigation while concealing a voyage that had diverged dramatically from its intended course. Maintaining that deception required increasing complexity. Each reported position needed to remain consistent with expected sailing speeds, prevailing weather, and the known progress of other competitors. As the race continued, Crowhurst faced the growing challenge of reconciling fictional navigation with the realities of ocean travel. Every new transmission reduced the possibility of quietly ending the deception, while simultaneously increasing the consequences should it eventually be uncovered. Inside the surviving logbooks, investigators found a remarkably personal record of a voyage that was becoming increasingly detached from reality. Crowhurst maintained several sets of records, including navigational logs intended to support the reported voyage and private writings that revealed a far more complicated emotional landscape. These journals later became one of the most extraordinary collections of evidence ever recovered from an abandoned vessel, because they documented not only events at sea but also the thoughts of the person experiencing them. The entries show a gradual shift in tone over time. Earlier passages reflect practical concerns involving navigation, equipment, and the demands of solo sailing. Later writings become increasingly philosophical, introspective, and difficult to interpret. Crowhurst explored ideas about time, existence, mathematics, consciousness, and the nature of reality, often moving rapidly between technical observations and deeply personal reflections. Historians and psychologists have long studied these writings because they appear to document an individual experiencing extraordinary psychological strain under prolonged isolation. Interpreting the journals requires caution. They cannot provide a definitive medical diagnosis, nor do they explain every decision Crowhurst made during the voyage. Nevertheless, they offer a rare window into the mental pressures associated with extreme isolation at sea. Unlike most maritime disappearances, where investigators must infer emotional circumstances from physical evidence alone, the Teignmouth Electron preserved the evolving thoughts of its missing sailor almost until the very end. As weeks passed, communications from Crowhurst became increasingly limited. By then, the race itself had changed dramatically. Several competitors had already withdrawn after encountering severe conditions, while others continued their circumnavigations across distant oceans. Crowhurst's reported progress placed him among the leading participants, creating the possibility that he might receive widespread recognition upon returning to England. That prospect carried an impossible contradiction. Success would inevitably invite detailed scrutiny capable of exposing the false voyage documented in his transmitted positions. The pressure surrounding that realization has become one of the central themes in later interpretations of the case. Historians generally agree that Crowhurst eventually recognized the impossibility of reconciling his fabricated reports with a triumphant return. The closer the supposed voyage approached its conclusion, the fewer options remained. The journals suggest that he understood the consequences awaiting him regardless of which course he chose. Months after the last meaningful communications, the Teignmouth Electron was discovered drifting alone in the Atlantic without the man who had sailed it. On July 10, 1969, the yacht was found by the British merchant vessel Picardy in the mid-Atlantic Ocean. The trimaran remained afloat, but Donald Crowhurst was nowhere aboard. There were no signs of another vessel having taken him away, no indication of piracy, and no evidence that anyone else had recently occupied the yacht. Instead, investigators found a vessel whose most significant cargo consisted of notebooks, charts, and personal records. The condition of the yacht reflected a voyage interrupted rather than a violent catastrophe. Crowhurst's belongings remained aboard, as did the journals that would later become the foundation of nearly every investigation into his disappearance. Because there were no eyewitnesses to his final moments, these written records assumed extraordinary importance. They documented what the sailor had experienced and believed, but they ended before revealing the precise circumstances under which he disappeared. What remained aboard offered investigators valuable insight, but it stopped just short of revealing the voyage's final moments. The final journal entries have been interpreted in different ways over the decades, yet most historians agree that they indicate profound psychological distress. Whether Crowhurst intentionally entered the sea, accidentally fell overboard, or encountered some other unforeseen event cannot be established with certainty, because no direct evidence survives beyond the writings themselves. His body was never recovered. The accepted historical interpretation is that Crowhurst most likely died after leaving the yacht voluntarily, with many researchers concluding that suicide represents the most probable explanation. Even so, the absence of definitive physical evidence prevents absolute certainty. Maritime history contains numerous disappearances where circumstances must be reconstructed from incomplete records, and the Teignmouth Electron remains one of the most compelling examples, because its surviving evidence illuminates so much while leaving the single, most important question unanswered. The recovered journals transformed the investigation into something far more unusual than the search for a missing sailor, preserving an extraordinary record of isolation, while leaving the final chapter forever unwritten. Unlike the crews of other abandoned ships whose thoughts vanished with them, Donald Crowhurst left behind a deeply personal account of mounting pressure, uncertainty, and prolonged solitude. Those pages allow historians to understand the emotional landscape of the voyage more clearly than almost any comparable maritime case, yet they cannot bridge the final gap between the last written words and the moment the yacht continued without its only occupant. Somewhere between the last journal entry and the drifting Teignmouth Electron, the Atlantic kept the only witness that could explain what truly happened: the Resolven, the Welsh mystery that inspired generations. On the open ocean, one ship can become the only witness to another's silent distress long before anyone understands what has happened. Merchant captains routinely watch the movements of nearby vessels, looking for signals of danger, damaged rigging, or unusual behaviour that might indicate a crew in need of assistance. Most encounters ended with nothing more than ships passing each other on separate courses. Occasionally, however, a vessel would continue sailing in a way that suggested something had gone terribly wrong, inviting those nearby to investigate a silence that the sea itself could not explain. By the late 19th century, commercial sailing ships still formed an essential part of transatlantic trade, even as steam-powered vessels steadily transformed maritime transportation. Brigs and schooners carried timber, coal, and general cargo between Britain and North America, following routes that were busy enough to ensure regular traffic, yet vast enough for an emergency to unfold beyond the view of anyone else. When difficulties arose far from shore, another passing ship often represented the only chance of discovering what had happened. During the summer of 1884, a British merchant brig named the Resolven departed from Wales on what appeared to be another ordinary commercial voyage. Built in 1867, the vessel had established a reputation as a dependable trading ship, operating under the British flag. Commanded by Captain John James, the brig sailed from Holyhead carrying a cargo of timber bound for Canada. Nothing recorded at the beginning of the voyage suggested that the Resolven would soon become associated with one of the quieter, yet enduring mysteries in maritime history. Like countless merchant captains of the era, John James and his crew were accustomed to the uncertainties of the North Atlantic. Sudden weather changes, heavy seas, dense fog, and navigational hazards formed part of everyday life aboard commercial sailing vessels. Experienced crews expected difficult conditions and relied upon routine, discipline, and practical seamanship to complete voyages safely. If the Resolven encountered trouble after leaving Wales, no surviving record identifies the exact moment when an ordinary crossing became something far more unusual. Concern first arose when another vessel observed the brig behaving in a way that suggested something aboard was no longer under human control. On August 29, 1884, the brig HMS Mallard, despite its name, a merchant vessel rather than a Royal Navy warship, encountered the Resolven off the coast of Newfoundland. Those aboard noticed that the brig appeared to be moving erratically. Rather than responding normally to nearby traffic, the vessel's movements indicated that no one was actively managing its course. Recognizing that something was wrong, the captain of the Mallard ordered a boarding party to investigate. Such actions were not unusual when an apparently abandoned or distressed vessel was encountered at sea. Maritime tradition encouraged assistance whenever possible, and an unattended ship represented both a potential danger to navigation and a possible opportunity to rescue survivors. As the boarding party approached the Resolven, they had little reason to expect that the greatest mystery would not concern the condition of the ship itself, but the complete absence of everyone responsible for sailing it. Once the boarding party crossed onto the deck, the mystery deepened with every careful observation they made. the Resolven remained afloat and appeared largely seaworthy. There was no evidence that the vessel had suffered catastrophic structural damage or the kind of destruction expected after a violent collision. Its cargo of timber remained aboard, indicating that the ship had not been abandoned following an act of theft or salvage. Although the voyage had clearly been interrupted, the brig itself showed no obvious signs explaining why experienced sailors would suddenly leave it behind. Contemporary reports describing the discovery are notably restrained, particularly when compared with later retellings that often surround ghost ships. Early accounts confirm that the vessel was abandoned and that its cargo remained in place, but many of the dramatic details repeated in later books, such as meals waiting on the table or evidence that the crew had vanished only moments before the boarding party arrived, cannot be firmly traced to the earliest surviving reports. Over time, these additions gradually became attached to the story, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish documented facts from later embellishment. Even without those dramatic details, the circumstances remain deeply puzzling. The boarding party found no crew members anywhere aboard the brig. Captain John James had disappeared along with every person sailing under his command. No confirmed explanation accompanied their absence, and no witnesses came forward to describe what had happened during the final stage of the voyage. The Resolven had become another vessel that survived its crew. Although the ship itself remained capable of continuing its voyage, the people responsible for sailing it had disappeared without leaving an obvious explanation. If the crew had abandoned the brig voluntarily, investigators naturally expected some event serious enough to justify that decision. Yet the condition of the vessel did not clearly point toward a single emergency. An orderly abandonment of a seaworthy merchant ship represented an unusual decision for experienced mariners who understood that remaining aboard was often safer than taking to a small boat in the open Atlantic. One possibility considered by later researchers is that the crew may have entered a boat after believing the Resolven faced an immediate but ultimately temporary danger. Ships occasionally suffered hidden damage, shifting cargo or other problems that appeared more threatening than they later proved to be. If Captain James concluded that abandoning the brig offered the best chance of survival, the crew could have departed together, only to encounter fatal conditions before reaching another vessel or the nearest coastline. Unfortunately, no evidence survives to confirm that such an evacuation occurred. Another suggestion involves the possibility of severe weather. The North Atlantic has claimed countless ships through rapidly changing conditions capable of overwhelming even experienced crews. A sudden squall, rogue wave, or unexpected emergency might have separated the crew from their vessel if they were working over the side or attempting repairs during difficult conditions. Yet this explanation also remains speculative because the surviving historical record provides no direct evidence describing such an event aboard the Resolven. Collision has occasionally been mentioned as another theoretical possibility. If the brig had encountered another ship under circumstances that endangered the crew, but left the hull largely intact, an emergency evacuation might have followed. However, contemporary descriptions do not report the extensive damage one might expect after a serious impact. Without physical evidence or eyewitness testimony, this idea remains no more than one of several possibilities historians have considered over the years. Investigators could propose several possibilities, yet none accounted for every known detail surrounding the abandoned brig. Unlike famous maritime disasters that generated lengthy official inquiries, the disappearance of the Resolven left behind relatively little documentary evidence. No confirmed survivors emerged to describe the crew's final hours, and no later discovery definitively established their fate. As a result, historians have been forced to work with a remarkably limited collection of contemporary reports, each offering only part of the larger picture. That scarcity of documentation has shaped the mystery almost as much as the disappearance itself. Many ghost ships became famous because investigators found numerous clues that resisted explanation. The Resolven followed a different path. Here, the challenge lies not in interpreting an abundance of evidence, but in understanding an event preserved through only a small number of surviving records. Every unanswered question has remained unresolved, largely because the historical trail ends so abruptly. Later retellings gradually introduced dramatic details that were not consistently supported by the earliest surviving accounts, making the historical record almost as intriguing as the disappearance itself. Comparisons with the Mary Celeste encouraged writers to emphasize similarities between the two abandoned vessels, sometimes incorporating details that appear difficult to verify through contemporary reporting. As these versions circulated through books, magazines, and collections of maritime mysteries, The legend surrounding the Resolven steadily grew beyond what can confidently be established from the available evidence. Even so, removing those embellishments does not diminish the mystery. The documented facts remain compelling on their own. A merchant brig departed on a routine voyage across the Atlantic under the command of an experienced captain. Weeks later, another vessel found it abandoned yet still afloat, its cargo remaining aboard while every member of its crew had disappeared. More than a century after the event, no verified explanation has succeeded in closing the gap between those two moments. Even with careful examination of the available evidence, the Resolven remains one of the quieter maritime mysteries whose unanswered questions have endured far longer than its voyage. It has never achieved the worldwide recognition of the Mary Celeste, nor has it become surrounded by the same volume of speculation, yet its enduring appeal lies precisely in that restraint. The historical record preserves enough to establish that something unusual happened aboard the brig, while withholding the single piece of evidence that might have explained everything. The Resolven reached the end of its known voyage without its crew, leaving behind a mystery that has never entirely drifted out of maritime history.